wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Give me a full ballerina skirt and a hint of saloon, and I'm on board.
I can't go back.
Welcome to the She Became Visible podcast. I'm your host, Rene Steelman. This podcast is my story. It's your story. It's our story. It's all the stories of all the women who one day knew that it was time to remember who they were, who they are, and stand up and be seen. Good afternoon. Welcome to She Became Visible. I'm very excited. I'm not going to waste a lot of time with any other information. Similar to when, they stand up in church and say, we're not going to take up a lot of time, but let me give you 4,000 hours of, information. So I'm not going to do that. I have, as my guest today, Felicia Marsh, and I'm going to read you her bio because, like I said to Felicia when we met this morning, her bio makes me feel like a total slacker. Like, what have you been doing for 65 years, Anyway, yeah. So Felicia Marsh is a MA LPC. She is the owner and clinical director of her private practice located in Scottsdale, Arizona, where she specializes in child and adult trauma-focused care. Felicia received a Master's of Arts in Counseling and a Certificate of Advanced Graduate Studies in the Treatment of Trauma, Abuse, and Deprivation from Ottawa University. She received a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Arizona State University, where she minored in both pre-med biology and theater. I think that's a fabulous combination.
Thank you.
And she is a clinical and forensic mental health therapist working with victims and offenders of violent crime with specialized training in domestic violence and sexual abuse, and works with children, adolescents, and adults. And I could go on for another 4,000 pages of her background, but welcome, Felicia.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh. And the reason I contacted Felicia is because, as many of you know, there is a big storm in the world of news concerning the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and a very severe sexual child abuse case in Bisbee, Arizona. And one of the things that comes up in a lot of people's conversations is the state-by-state ruling of whether any kind of ecclesiastical leader is required by law to report abuse. And so I contacted Felicia, and we're going to discuss that. I have learned that it is a state-by-state law. Is that correct, as far as you understand it?
Yes.
And there are states, I think, if I remember correctly, Oregon, Washington, and New York are mandatory reporting states. I think California is also required. But there are states like Arizona that do have little clicks in there that kind of let this client penitent, where they have a privacy. There's a privacy law which prevents them from. So anyway, if any of you have not, let me just give you a little bit of background information. If any of you are not aware, please pull up the AP News. The article came out the 1st of August. My printer will not give me an exact date, but I think it was 7th or 8th. I can't tell. But anyway, the 1st of August, 2022. The article was written by Michael Resendez, and he is the reporter who broke the story of child abuse in the Catholic Church, and he was the focus of the movie Spotlight that talked about the Catholic Church and the problem they were having with child abuse. So he wrote this article, and as I mentioned, it was about a family in Arizona with a severe case of child abuse. So I contacted Felicia, and I said, "Are you aware of this?" And she said, "Oh, yeah." So tell me, you mentioned that you are kind of, your specialty is helping people that have had sexual abuse, trauma, or other kinds of sexual abuse. So tell me how you fell into that. Was that something that you decided right out of your learning that this was an area that you wanted to focus on? And then also go into your experience now as a therapist and what you're running into.
Sure. So I grew up knowing that I wanted to be a therapist by the age of 12.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So I had a lot of personal experiences growing up that kind of led me in that direction, including growing up with abuse in the home. And I won't get into specifics,
Sure.
but I definitely have experience with that. And then knowing others growing up with similar issues and situations, it just became a big passion of mine. So I started studying it at a very early age, and just took my life and education in that direction. And now like you said, I do have my own private practice, and I work with victims of sexual abuse, domestic violence, other types of abuse and trauma. And I do work with children and adults both. And then, I'm sorry, what was your other question?
Well, the question was, when did you kind of start area of focus became sexual abuse or sexual trauma? And do you see that as more of the people that are coming to you, is that the trauma that they've dealt with more than other forms of PTSD or something like that? Is that what you deal with most?
Yeah, I would say the majority of my cases are split between sexual abuse and domestic violence. So lots of adult domestic violence victims. But I'm actually a board certified sexual abuse expert. So people do seek me out because of that sexual abuse expertise. I actually specialized, I guess, in sexual abuse after I graduated with my master's degree, and while I was working on my initial licensure for my independent license, I worked at the Resolution Group in Mesa, working with both victims and offenders of sexual abuse. So that's where I got the bulk of my sexual abuse training, and then I just took that into my own practice.
Okay, is that center in Mesa, is that for only people that have suffered with some kind of sexual abuse?
They actually do work with child victims of all trauma, but they started out strictly as sexual abuse.
Okay. I'm curious to find out, I was listening today to some statistics, and they were saying that Utah is the highest statistic ratio of child abuse in the nation, with Idaho coming in second, and I believe California coming in third, or it could have been all three of them rank higher in statistics as children, of course, females more than male, but the statistics are higher in Utah, Idaho, and California. And ironically, the number of Mormons in a state, completely disregarding any kind of abuse, but just religiously, the number of Mormons in the United States, the highest number is Arizona, Idaho, and California. So I think that's a very, like I heard, it's not a causation, but it's definitely a correlation. And so I think that's very interesting. And I think it's a little bit hard to kind of separate those two things from the relationship between the church and the dogma that goes behind some of the way the church handles discretions in a lot of different areas. But so I know when we talked on the phone, you mentioned that you deal with a lot of people that come from fundamental religions that have this problem with sexual abuse. Can you talk about that a little bit and why that is, you think?
Yeah. So with these fundamental Christian or just fundamental religions in general, there is a lot of dogma, and they are very controlled and sheltered within those communities and those cultures. So they typically only associate with other people in that particular religion or organization. So they are very sheltered. They don't get a lot of outside influence or experiences. So they just don't know what they don't know, in addition to being indoctrinated with very puritanical beliefs and standards, it's just sort of a perfect breeding ground to create victims, and there's no checks and balances for the perpetrators.
Do you find that in primarily the Abrahamic religions? So you've got, the Christians, Jewish, Islam, Muslim, where there's a very high patriarchal hierarchy, and so it's a very male-dominated religion, and so does that contribute to the amount of sexual abuse that goes on in those groups or communities?
It certainly could. So theoretically, yes, the more patriarchal a particular religion is, of course, the more likelihood they are to protect men in that particular religion. I don't know that we have the statistics necessarily on all of the different religions and cultures and sexual abuse. At least I can't recall specifically, but there is definitely a correlation there.
Sure. And I wonder too if some of the what do you think some of the elements are? Like you said, the isolation is one, where they're almost instructed religiously to stay away from people that are in the world, or stay away from people that don't believe the way you do because they might harm your faith or somehow persuade you. So that's one thing that they have in common. And then there's the purity culture, which goes along with the modesty culture, which seems to be thrown on women, not men. And, that's one of the things I struggle with a lot, because there's so many wonderful people that aren't as black and white thinking as I am, as I was trained to be. I mean, I grew up in a black and white thinking family, and then the church that I belonged to formerly was very black and white. It's either good or bad. Yeah. And so I struggle with it. And I really admire people who can look at the gray areas and give space for other thinking. But one of the areas that I really struggle with is the burqa and the thing that, and with freedom of religion and freedom to write. And I know there are probably quite a few of these women that they do this willingly and lovingly, just like people that were in my church go along with the polygamy and some of the patriarchy, because it brings them happiness. It works in their home, so they don't find any reason to not go along with it. But dang, that's hard. There's a very large community where I used to live, and I would see these women in the grocery store and just completely covered from head to toe. And then there's their husband in a pair of jeans and in a shirt. And I'm like, why is that okay? Why do you think that's okay?
Yeah, that's horrible.
Yeah. But so that's one of the things I struggle with. But in Arizona specifically, because we're going back to this AP article, what is the ruling as far as mandatory reporting in Arizona, so we can get that clear right out the back? In case people are going, well, that's not true because in my bishop reported a case, and that kind of thing. So we need to nip that in the bud. That in Arizona, in the state of Arizona, what is the mandate?
So, according to the Department of Child Safety in the state of Arizona, anyone who hears about any sort of abuse to a minor, so someone under the age of 18 or another vulnerable individual, is required by law to report that abuse. However, there is no statute or regulation regarding clergy. There's no license or anything like that clergy necessarily need to have, especially in the Mormon religion. They aren't certified or anything like that. So they may interpret that a little bit differently, thinking that, well, they told me this in confidence, so therefore I don't need to report it because it's clergy privilege. Yes. However, that's not actually what the law says. The law says that anyone, so this includes parents, it includes caregivers, it includes teachers, anyone with whom this child has a close relationship, or to whom the child goes to disclose this information, you are obligated to report. You are a mandated reporter at that point in time.
Okay, so they don't specify necessarily.
They do not specify.
So like I've heard, in certain states that teachers or doctors are mandated to, they must report. So they don't. So that's why this doctor, who was also the bishop of this family, was not required. Oh, well, no, actually, he was required because he's a human. So in Arizona, you're saying if you are a human,
if you're
an adult human, you are required, to report. So the fact that he was their family physician and the bishop, he was like 3 times required. You're a human, you're a doctor, and you're a clergy.
Yes.
And you chose not to report it.
Yes. Yeah, that would definitely be illegal.
Interesting. So one of the problems I think too that has been brought up because of this article is the ability to rehabilitate perpetrators, abusers. And then also talk a little bit about that, the ability to rehabilitate, and then also the ability to heal for these poor kids that have been. So what are the statistics on that as far as lifelong success in either, not necessarily, I hate to use the word getting over, because you're never going to get over or something like that, but being able to be a successful functioning adult with this trauma. So do you know what the statistics are as far as like being able to rehabilitate perpetrators?
Honestly, it depends on the type of perpetrator. So there are different categories of offenders, and those categories are based on what the particular perpetrator is motivated by. So you have some who are sex addicts or highly sexualized, and they're more opportunistic, as opposed to someone who's a little bit more organized and methodical and actually plans out and looks to target and groom victims. Then you have a different category, such as pedophiles, and those are the ones who are sexually attracted to prepubescent individuals. So you do have different types of offenders. So, we would have to take that into account when discussing this.
Right.
So in order for anyone to change, they first and foremost have to want to change.
There you go. That's always true. You can lead a horse to water, right? That's the old saying, the old cliche.
So even if they're mandated to go to treatment through a court order, probation, etc., that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take it to heart or that they are going to change their sexual desires or motivations. What we do see oftentimes is maintenance of symptoms or maintenance of sobriety, so to speak, with regards to not relapsing because they don't want to get in trouble. Because pedophiles, for example, they actually have to be on lifetime probation and continue with maintenance because they are actually attracted to children, so they're considered more at risk to reoffend, recidivism. So someone who is still on probation or still has to check into treatment every once in a while is probably less likely to offend overall because they don't want to get in trouble. So when we talk about treatment or healing an offender, etc., we have to know, like, what are we looking at and what does that actually mean? And really all that means is not reoffending. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to fix them.
That's true.
Because there really isn't a treatment for that necessarily.
Right.
There's no real cure for pedophilia or things like that we know of. It's just more maintenance of don't do that again, or your consequences are going to be more severe.
That's interesting because, like you say, comparing it to any of the sobriety programs that are out there that have, systems set up where you can go anywhere in the world. Let's say if you're suffering with alcoholism or drug abuse or something like that, and you've decided to join AA, that's going to be your support program. You can go anywhere and find a program. And a lot of these people daily go to a program, something like that. They have a sponsor that they can call at any time. Is there anything like that set up for people that are suffering or dealing with the sexual, abuse issue? Like if you're a pedophiliac and you know that about yourself, you've gone through a program, you don't want to offend anymore, Do you have a sponsor? Is there a meeting you can go to every week? Do you have a coin? I've been free for a year. It's like,
Not a coin. So the AAs and even like Sex Addicts Anonymous. So those are not run by professionals.
Right.
So those are strictly more like peer support programs where you can go to get support. But if you're dealing with something that is an actual crime, sex offense or sex offenders are criminals because they have committed a sex offense, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So a treatment program would have to consist of the legal component. So, probably someone to check in with in probation, having an actual therapist, et cetera. So with regards to the programs like you're talking about, there is a Sex Addicts Anonymous. However, that, yes, somebody could go to that for sure just to get a sponsor, but that does not address the offense, because an offense is a behavior that isn't necessarily even related to sex addiction. You can be a sex offender without being a sex addict, and vice versa. So you really need professional treatment if someone is a sexual abuser.
Interesting. And then, like you say, there's the legal aspect where there are people that voluntarily go into some kind of a drug addiction or alcoholism, and they've never gotten a DUI.
Correct.
They've never done anything illegal. They just know that this is really harming their lifestyle and their family or whatever, so they choose to do that. Versus, like you say, and if people act on some kind of a sexual dysfunction, then there's going to be a criminality attached to it.
Correct.
That's a good point. That's a really good point. Okay.
Yeah, it's very complex.
Very complex. And I know I watched a documentary the other day about, and I can't remember what state it was in, but there was a village of mobile homes that people who had been arrested and convicted of some kind of sexual crime, especially involving children, and then they have those laws that are put into, you can't live within so many feet or so many yards, that kind of thing. So they have started this little village that these men mostly live in because they want to be there to support each other. I thought, well, that's an idea. Maybe we should start these villages, But the one guy was admitting, he was saying, I am a pedophilia. I'm not going to get cured. I know this is my problem. This is what I've done. I really like living here because there's no temptation. We support each other. We're here for each other, yada, yada, yada. I was like, wow. Okay, that was very interesting.
That could also be a double-edged sword, though. Get a bunch of, pedophiles and sex
kidding.
offenders together. It's like, oh God, what are you,
know.
So yes, on the one hand, that can certainly be supportive, but then it's like, oh, okay.
But then also, do you have internet? Because that's a bad thing.
Yeah,
too,
they shouldn't have internet.
Yeah, exactly.
So those who actually do have pedophilia typically, like I said, have to be on lifetime probation and maintenance, and they're not allowed to have internet access.
Right. So how do you deal, because like I said, I think people think that this is a black and white problem. I think they think a person comes to an ecclesiastical leader, a pastor, a bishop, a priest, or whatever, and they admit that they have a problem. They have a problem with pornography, like this gentleman did, and he also admitted to his bishop that he was abusing his 5-year-old. And so you admit that, and then the bishop in this particular religion, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in 1995, they started a hotline. And before that time, they just would tell the bishops, we'll find out what the law is in your state and act accordingly. But then in 1995, there was an increase of lawsuits that were going up against the church. And they're like, all right, we've got to put some kind of silly putty in this hole or we're going to lose all our water. So they started this helpline, which directly goes to their law firm that sees over the corporation. So anyway, it took a long time for all of this to come to be. But people, what they're saying right now, people who have had the experience of going to an ecclesiastical leader and saying, my stepfather is abusing me, or my brother is abusing me, my bishop is abusing me, or whatever. People think, well, the bishop should have been required to call the police. Therefore, I think what they're thinking is, therefore, A equals B equals safety. And I think that there's a lot of systems out there. This is a system that's broken, that needs to be fixed. There's also some problems with calling the police or calling Child Protective Services. So can you talk a little bit about how it's not. I mean, I think there is a black and white yes or no. Yes, you should do this.
Right.
This
Yes.
needs to be reported.
Yes.
So that's not an issue. We're not saying, well, should the bishops have to report? No, that's not the issue. We're saying, yes, they should. But then what happens if a bishop was to call, in your opinion, what would be the first person? Do we call the police first? Do we call Child Protective Services first? And what constitutes abuse? Like if there's a family in your congregation that's neglecting their children, not necessary sexual abuse, but how far up do we interfere with these families, or where do we get people involved? What is your experience with that?
Sure. So with regards to neglect and abuse, and what do we report? So we would need to report anything that is actually harmful to a child. Now, for me, for example, solo practitioner, I don't have the resources necessarily to help a family. Whereas, a bishop or a clergy member, if they see a family who just doesn't have a lot, and maybe the children are being neglected, they certainly have much more resources to be like, hey, I see so-and-so is, coming in dirty clothes. Like, let's go to your home. Let's take a look. Let's see what you need. They have much more services to be able to help out without necessarily jumping to, calling DCS.
That's a really good point, because what you're comparing there is the difference between an ecclesiastical system that can go into a home and say, look, we've got some neglect going on here.
Right.
Do you need food? Do you need clothing? Does someone need to show you how to use a washing machine?
Yes, exactly.
Do we need to bring in somebody that can help? Is the mother suffering with depression? We need someone to come in and help her with the children. That's something that maybe a bishop could be told by someone else, because these people are not therapists and they're not professionals, but say, I think we could handle this locally. And we can handle this in our congregation without having to report that, at least in the beginning.
At least in the beginning, yeah.
But is that the beginning of the correlation where, look, we can bring them food, we can pay their rent, we can bring them clothing, we can provide school supplies, because it's a very wealthy organization. They're overlapping that into, and we can also help you with sexual abuse. Is that kind of like I was like, okay, now you've just crossed a crazy line.
Yeah. So there definitely is a line. So let's say, for example, this theoretical family we have who's been neglectful for whatever reason. And let's say the church gives them the resources, and now you kind of sit back and you see, okay, do they use the resources? What do they do when those resources are done? Do they ask for help? Do they continue?
Follow up.
Do they continue to neglect? Okay. So if we then see continued neglect beyond that, you would probably want to take steps to say, okay, what needs to be done, and do we now need to call DCS? However, there is definitely a line that is crossed when it comes to abuse. Abuse is much more black and white. So let's say a child comes in with bruises and says, mom or dad hit me with a belt, or they hit me with a baseball bat, or they kicked me, etc. Then we would have to report that, because that is a firsthand report of, this person did this to me, and you're a mandated reporter, so now you have to report, hey, somebody in this home is hurting this child. The same with sexual abuse. Sexual abuse of any child is a crime. That is an automatic report. So whether it's so-and-so touched me over the clothes, under the clothes, doesn't matter. You have to make a report on that. That would include exposing yourself to children, taking photos of children naked, having them pose, showing them pornography, etc.
That's very interesting, because that completely absorbs everything that was talked about in this article. Everything you just described was in that, very obvious that, and that there was people. They said when the Homeland Security came to the home, there was cans of lubricant, or laying around. Hello, that's more than a red flag.
That's more than a red
flyover.
Yes.
And I mean, so there were so many indications exposing himself, openly watching pornography in front of the children.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, there were 6 children altogether, and 3 of them were abused. So, and I don't know if they were boys, girls, or if all 3 were the girls. I know 2 of them were girls. So there were so many things that the checkbox, check. We got a really bad problem here. So that is very, 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 very sad. Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that you said that in the state of Arizona, every adult is required and mandated to report.
Correct.
So this is going to be an interesting case to keep our eyes on for sure.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I know you were very aware of this letter that came out in the AP. Are you aware of the church's response to the article? Have you heard anything about that?
You know what? I can't remember. I don't think so.
Okay. There's been 2.
Okay.
The first one that came out that said, that was mean. You guys hurt our feelings. We're really good people. We like Jesus, And then the second one was like, oh, we're not putting up with that, And they kind of classified the AP on the same level as like TMZ or People Magazine, and we're kind of like, yeah, that's not going to work.
No.
That's not going to work. So, who brings the children to you as a sex therapist who deals with abuse? Who's bringing these babies to you? Is it the parents, or who is referring these people to you?
Yeah, so currently with being in private practice, it usually is the parent or the current caregiver. Most of them, it would be the actual parents bringing them in, the biological parents or the adoptive parents bringing them into me. Now, when I worked at a community agency, it may have actually been the foster parents or the adoptive parents. Sometimes it was actually the DCS guardian, social worker who would bring them in. But in private practice, it usually is the parents.
Okay, so they find out from their children or somehow that child has been abused.
Yes.
Obviously, it's not either one of them, or they wouldn't both be bringing their kids in. Or do they have people that are like, oh, it was a Thursday night. I was really busy. And I was just so stressed out, and I abused my child. No. I think sometimes the stories I hear, that's honestly how some of these ecclesiastical leaders look at it. It's like, he's a good guy, but he was stressed. They give so many excuses for this behavior.
It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah, exactly.
What?
He was a good guy. I'm like, meaning what?
Yeah, what does that? And then they were stressed. Like,
yeah.
how's that supposed to be an excuse?
Yeah. But anyway, so well, let's address that then. So if you have parents that are bringing their children to you, and let's say one of the parents was the abuser, where do we go from there?
Yeah, so that's probably half of
Seriously?
my child sexual abuse cases. It was one of the parents.
Biological or step?
It could be biological or step. So
Okay.
typically with those situations, if the alleged perpetrator was a biological parent and the parents are not divorced, that becomes a very tricky subject for me.
Yeah.
So
talk about mandate.
Yeah. So if if the child discloses that to me in session, then I would then have to make a police report on that, and that becomes very sticky. With the other parent. Sometimes they're actually in a custody case. Let's say mom is aware that child said dad sexually abused them. Mom and dad are divorced, or they're going through a divorce. Mom currently has sole legal decision making because of the abuse allegations. That makes it a little bit easier from a legal perspective because then I don't have so much red tape. But really, we see it could be a biological parent, it could be a step parent, it could be another family member, older sibling. There's just so many different people in someone's life it could be.
Right. Wow. So that whole idea that the secrecy policy that I know the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is just completely enveloped in the idea that secrecy works, and that secrecy is the way that we keep everything rolling, and started in the very beginning of the church. And I don't understand why people don't see that behind every form of abuse there's a secrecy
there's
code.
always yes. Yeah.
And so the idea that we keep silent to, like you were saying, okay, so now we're gonna come and see a therapist, but we want to keep this private. We want to keep it in the family and that kind of thing. To save the family.
I have to let them know, heads up, I am a mandated reporter and I will report. And, sometimes I have told parents, like, look, the child already told you that they were sexually abused. You actually need to be the one to make a report, before I ever start working with them.
Okay.
And sometimes the parent will say, well, I really don't want to. And I said, well, you are a mandated reporter. And if you don't protect your child, you can actually get charged with neglect by DCS for failure to protect, like, what's wrong with you. So,
right. Interesting, because I know in this particular case, they were, allegedly, they were told by the church attorneys to encourage other people to report. So, like, you don't report, but can you get the wife to report, or can you get somebody else to report? And she, one of the things that made me just absolutely was on the second response from the church, they kind of put the two parents together, and they said, neither one of the parents did anything, and the wife served some jail time. The husband committed suicide when he was in custody of the police, and so almost like, well, it was both their fault. And it was like, okay, we need to talk about the abused wife, and where that, and even the bishop, who was the doctor, aka also the family doctor, acknowledged that she was a textbook case of the abused wife syndrome. She had checked out. She was like empty. He could see she was hollow inside. Yeah. And she did serve some time. But so how do you do your job, first of all? How do you do your job? But I mean, how do you deal with that? So you've got both parents coming in. Let's say they've got a custody thing. Yeah. She's mandated to report. But she's got this abusive husband, that's she's already mentally ill because of that. So is there, when it gets down to sentencing, is there some leniency in that case where you can see that the entire family's been abused? And, differently maybe, depends on if it's physical abuse or sexual abuse, probably both. So how do you deal with that? I mean, obviously this is not one mental issue.
Correct.
You're dealing with a whole family of mental issues in the family.
Right.
So, so you say to them, you understand that you are also mandatory reporters, and I am a mandatory reporter. So if you don't report this, I have to report this. And then do they come back? We'll see you next Thursday.
Sometimes people do. Like, sometimes parents actually appreciate, just how honest and upfront I am about certain things. And then there have been parents I've kind of scared off because they're like, oh man, she's, we want to keep this a secret in the family.
Tell our family
she's going to, So it really just depends.
Wow. Okay. But then you've got the program that works, kind of, where they've taken the children out of the home and now they're in some kind of foster care. The foster parents, part of the deal is they're also going to receive therapy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is it mandated that they receive therapy if they're placed in a foster home?
Usually DCS, the Department of Child Safety, will absolutely mandate therapy for the child victim because they have been through trauma. So normally they do get them in. But here's the thing. Just because a child is taken away from the parents doesn't necessarily mean that they're put immediately into foster care with some random foster family.
Okay, so they might be put in with family or something like that.
Yeah, so DCS always tries to go with the next of kin, or who is closest to the family, who is safe, who can provide for these children, who, has an adequate income, who has a safe home, all of those sorts of things. So they will do their due diligence to try to keep the children within the family system, or at least with someone that they know, right, if at all possible, before just jumping to some sort of random foster
strangers.
family.
Okay. And then if let's say they go with grandma and grandpa, then are grandma and grandpa mandated to take them into therapy? Is that part of the deal? Like,
yes.
Will you be willing to take the child, and will you
Yes,
take
that's
them to
typically
therapy?
part of their contract.
Okay. That's a great program. I mean, unfortunately now families are so separated. You've got, family that lives all over the country, But still, there's a lot of fabulous people that have stepped in to save children for sure. And I know in the state of Arizona, there were people that stepped in to help these kids that were taken from this particular family, thank heavens. But it's absolutely amazing. So what's the youngest child that you've treated?
2 years old.
No.
Yeah.
And how do you converse? How do you deal with a child that's barely verbal at that point?
Yeah, so for young children, we typically just do play therapy or expressive arts. And then for children 5 and under, I also incorporate family therapy or parental parent-child sessions.
So the parent's in the room.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then just tell the audience a little bit about what you do in play therapy.
Yeah, so play therapy is a big topic. It's complex. So a lot of people think play therapy, well, you're just sitting and playing with them. Well, no, you do have to be licensed to do play therapy because it has to be based on some sort of theoretical orientation. So I do trauma-focused play therapy where first I'll initially just kind of observe the child and building rapport with them from a very child-centered perspective, maybe reflecting what they're doing, but I'm kind of more hands-off in the first few sessions because I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel comfortable. They haven't really had places where they've been safe. So I just want them to know this is a safe place for you to come. Okay. You can talk about anything you want. You can play with things. There are a few rules, but this is really just your special
And
time.
do they know why they're there? I mean, how do you tell the child, you know, you're living with grandma and we're going to go see Felicia and then what? I mean, then what do they say? Because Daddy hurt you and we want to
So most
our
of
mommy
them
hurt you. I have to be fair. There are abusive women as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So typically speaking, children are going to know why they're going to counseling. Sometimes they may not, especially if they're younger and they're pre-verbal, you know, under 3 years of age per se. So that's where I come in and just, you know, build a safe relationship with them. And they don't necessarily need to know why they're there because they're, you know, they're pre-verbal. They have no context for that.
So it's like maybe we're just going to do a fun play date. We're going to go see this lady. We're going to play with some toys.
Yep.
It's going to be so fun.
Absolutely.
That's all we have to tell them at that point.
That's really all you have to tell them, you know, around that age.
Okay.
But for the older kiddos who are much more verbal and who can at least cognitively understand, okay, somebody hurt me and that's why I need to, you know, have a special person to talk to. I do a lot of education with them on this is what happened to you. This is what it's called. It's called abuse. And then, you know, I go through safe and unsafe secrets, healthy and unhealthy boundaries, safe and unsafe relationships. Like there's kind of a structured curriculum per se that I go through with them.
Is the secrecy a big part where you try? It's hard to convince someone that's been threatened, especially children, that you can convince them that it's okay to tell that there isn't a danger. Is that a difficult area that you have to deal with?
Sometimes not as much. So the whole safe secrets versus unsafe secrets, I do a whole sort of module on that with them as well. I have some books that cover that sort of topic. So I let them know, hey, you know, this is a safe secret, this is a unsafe secret. And then we go through some different examples and they're able to identify, okay, this is an unsafe secret and I need to tell. And sometimes at an end of a session like that, I will have kids actually disclose, yeah, somebody did touch me, you know, at school or wherever, because they've been able to understand, well, this is an unsafe secret and I probably need to tell.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with, because I attended a retreat recently and there was a woman there who she was being very vulnerable and telling her story. And what really destroyed her family was her older son had abused her younger son. I don't remember how anybody found out about it, but they did the right thing and they called authorities. The child was taken out of the home. The other children were also taken out of the home, but then they were returned. So I'm sure that was traumatic for the whole family. They were returned to the home, but the child that had initiated the sexual abuse ended up going to juvenile. And he's now in his 20s, and he's been in and out of prison his whole life. Drugs, comes out of a session or a program of some kind, and within weeks he's back into drugs and been through rehab many, many times. It's basically destroyed his life.
Yeah.
And the child that he abused has done well. They were able to get family therapy, and he's done well. But this child was destroyed. Mm-hmm. That's what people are afraid of when they refuse to call the authorities. They're like, I'm sure they're thinking, I can save my child. If I call authorities, it's going to destroy them and our whole entire family, and maybe we can fix this ourselves.
Oh boy.
So how do you address that? Because I think it's a legitimate fear. I mean, I don't think the prison system out in the world is particularly should be applauded. Mm-hmm. I don't see a lot of really good things. I see a lot of better programs in other countries.
Yeah.
So I don't know if our prison system is just, it's not 1950 where, Officer Jones is like, let him spend a night in jail. He'll be better for it. No, those days are gone.
No.
So, yeah. So how do you, because you can't guarantee, how do you console a family with that kind of fear?
Yeah, so when I'm explaining why we need to make police reports, I explain, okay, look, I know that it's difficult to call the police on your own child. However, the reason why we need to do this is, one, we need to hold the perpetrator accountable. And two, what we really want to do is try to protect future victims, because we know offenders are going to reoffend. It's not like they do it once and they're going to stop. Like that isn't how it works.
Right.
So I kind of have to explain that to parents sometimes. Like, look, this isn't a one-time thing, and if you think it is, you're very naive. They're going to continue, and typically speaking, over time, as they continue their offense cycle, their offenses get bigger and more complex over time. So they may start out small over here, but in 10 years from now, they could be, breaking into homes and raping people.
Right.
So we have to do what we can to stop the cycle, and that's how I explain that.
Yeah, and I think that's a concept that's really hard for people that don't have mental health issues to understand, that it is never going to be a one-time only.
Correct.
Because people do make mistakes, and they go, "Oh, I'm never doing that again." Somebody that's mentally healthy, would make a mistake. Maybe they drove drunk and got home one time, and they thought that was insane. I'm never doing that again. Or, so they put that on the same level as, oh, wow, I just abused a child. Whew, I'm never doing that again. Statistics show that's not the case in that kind of perversion.
No, and I don't understand why would anybody think that was a mistake? Like, how do you accidentally sexually abuse someone?
Exactly. Not the same thing as I forgot to pay for the crayons that were stuck under the shopping cart.
Right. It's like, no, your penis does not accidentally fall into a child's vagina. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So, sometimes you just have to break things down logically for people. Like, how does that make sense?
That I know, and I love that you said that, because honestly, the stories that I'm hearing, the stories that are coming out in different podcasts that are discussing this particular, that is how some of the authorities actually, like, it was a mistake. Like, it was like, oh, I accidentally wore a blue shoe and a black shoe today. My lighting was bad.
Yeah, no, it's never a mistake.
Yeah. And, I wish we had more time, because I'd love to talk more about the idea, like you say, the difference between a pedophile and, that's amazing to me that someone who grooms people, that takes a while, gets to know them. And even though they're under the age of, say, 12, would they be considered, what were the categories? You had the pedophile that goes particularly after prepubescent children.
Correct.
And then you have the person that grooms someone, gets their confidence, builds a relationship. Is there a title for that type of person? I guess that'd still be a pedophile, right?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
So yeah, you do have different different offender psychologies.
Okay.
Per se.
Okay.
So you have your organized criminals, who are the ones who do take time to plan and prepare, and they may or may not be a pedophile. A pedophile is someone who's only attracted to prepubescent children.
Okay.
And then you have sex offenders who are attracted to postpubescent, teenagers and adults. So it really depends on the particular psychology, what motivates them, how they work. You have your opportunistic that are, just kind of sex crazed per se.
Hello.
And, they see an opportunity and they take it without a lot of planning. So they kind of fall into organized and disorganized criminals.
See, I find that fascinating. Coming from a former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I find that fascinating. With the knowledge that has been brought in about the founder of the church, Joseph Smith, marrying young girls, and people, and I heard this on a wonderful, fabulous podcast done by Lindsay Hansen Park, who tries to teach people, and she keeps saying, stop calling Joseph Smith a pedophile. He was not a pedophile, but he definitely fell under the category of opportunist, grooming, all of these other categories that still puts him in the sex offender category. And I find that so fascinating because people are trying to, they're trying to, I forget what the technical term is, but they're clarifying that was done 150, 200 years ago. There were practices that went on then that aren't okay now. And I'm like, never was that okay. Ever. So let's stop using that as an excuse. But I do love that you separated those out because there is a category. There are different categories. So that's fascinating. Well, okay, Felicia, tell people about how they can follow you, where they can find your services, and how they can get in contact with you if they themselves are struggling. Tell everybody out there all about how they find you because you're amazing.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, and I'm happy to help anyone that I can. So I do have a website. It's lighthousecounselingaz.com. I also have a YouTube channel just under my name, Felicia Marsh, LPC. My Facebook and Twitter, I don't really do anything with those. So, but yeah, you can find me on my website and then on YouTube.
Okay. And I'll put those links in the podcast so people can click on those and find you because you're absolutely fascinating. And
Thank you so much.
I just want you to know, truly, I admire you so much because it's a tough job. It's not necessarily you're not climbing 50 stairs with oxygen tanks and a full fireman suit on, but the saving that you're doing, you don't also get to take off. You don't get to take off the oxygen tanks and go home and go, whew, that was a hard day. Yeah. I don't know how you sleep sometimes. It must be so, you have to do a lot of self-care.
I do a lot of self-care, a lot of grounding, a lot of meditation.
Yeah. And I thank heavens there's people like you and I do feel like it's a calling. I do feel like people like you, they know from the, that they're listeners and their heart goes that direction. And, I see that, we have a severely disabled son and my mom, I remember my mom suggesting that one time, you should open up a home that takes care of severely disabled people. And I'm like, I didn't sign up for this. This was not my calling to take care of disabled children. But there are people that are. I mean, there are, so there's so many different categories of fabulous people out there that they just know the lane that they should go down. And I admire that so much. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So, well, I feel badly for Felicia because she thinks she's going to escape and this is going to be a one and done. And I got news for her. She's going to be back. We're going to have her back. So, if you go on the She Became Visible Facebook page, if you would like to ask Felicia any questions or if you have a suggestion for a topic that you would like to cover with Felicia on the podcast, I am welcome to ideas because I think that would be really fun.
I would love that.
So,
yes.
okay.
Please feel free to message me.
Yeah, that would be so cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week.